All right, so now that we've learned kind of about the sort of the theory of the firm aspect of the hospital, now we're going to think about how it interacts in the marketplace, right? And there's numerous marketplaces that it interacts in, and we'll take a look at each of those. So, um, right, so in the last chapter we saw how organizational and cost structure of hospitals and other related issues, but now we're going to turn to the sort of dynamics of the hospital's marketplace activity. All right, so for this chapter, you want to be able to understand how hospitals simultaneously seek to attract doctors to their medical staffs as well as patients to their hospitals. So, again, something kind of unusual, not typical of most firms, is the fact that doctors are not technically employees of the hospital. They act independently, although they are associated with the hospital in terms of being part of the medical staff. Um, and so, in that sense, hospitals actually don't hire physicians. They instead kind of need to attract them, um, get them to want to be on their medical staff. Um, and the hospital also needs to attract patients. And sometimes these things go together. They complement each other. So what attracts physicians also attracts patients. But sometimes they go against each other so that the things that attract physicians actually repel patients. And sometimes there's really no relationship between them. So we're going to see different examples of each of those. You also want to master the model of market equilibrium for a not-for-profit hospital and discover how prices, quality, and quantity interact in the market for not-for-profit hospitals. You want to learn how the nature of competition has changed among hospitals as large buyers exert more power in the market. So, thinking kind of about the fact that nowadays hospitals very frequently will purchase private practices in order to attract physicians. So, that's actually one strategy, I guess. So, thinking about that in terms of market power and the market power they can exert. And then lastly, your last learning objective, um, being able to digest the consequences of large declines in demand for hospital services in recent decades. So we kind of touched on that a little bit with the outpatient surgery issue in the last chapter, right? The fact that hospitals really make their money by keeping people in beds. So when people have surgery and then go home the same day, they're losing out on what was previously a very strong source of revenue. But that has been declining in recent decades, primarily due to technology that has allowed patients to have outpatient surgery and not need to stay in the hospital, right? So those minimally invasive surgeries and those sorts of things. So looking at this issue and then thinking about how industry entry, and in this case mostly exit, how those things occur. All right, so again, just to kind of introduce this chapter, we're looking here at how hospitals interact with other hospitals, patients, and doctors in various marketplaces, as well as nurses and other types of labor. Right, those are also obtained in the various labor markets. So these are all and also other inputs like equipment, supplies. Right, those are also markets that the hospital participates in as far as inputs go. Um, and although we've primarily focused on not-for-profit hospitals, um, there's not going to be a lot that changes if the hospital is for profit or government run. We can still really think of a hospital as having a utility function and maximizing utility. It's just that to some degree, if it's a government run hospital, it's going to have slightly different objectives, right? But we can still kind of use this utility maximization approach. And even for profit hospitals, we can still use that approach as well. So not a lot is going to change. There might be some subtle changes, but for the most part, we can kind of move forward as we have been, regardless of the type of ownership or control over the hospital. Right. And like I already mentioned, there are many markets that the hospital participates in. And so we're going to look at how each of these markets relates to the hospital and its eventual survival and growth, if it is able to survive. All right, so we'll start with the market for medical staff, right? Physicians, getting doctors on their medical staff to so that they can start admitting patients, because the doctors are required for that, right? They have to. That's the only person that can admit someone to a hospital is a doctor, and they have to be on the medical staff, right? So, like I said, this is a pretty much a legal requirement, right? The hospital needs doctors. So that the hospital can practice medicine, right? It's kind of like a private practice. There has to be at least one licensed physician, kind of similar for hospitals, right? The hospital needs doctors so that it can practice medicine. But like we've discussed earlier, doctors are not actually employees of the hospital, but actually are independent entities. And so, in that sense, doctors are not actually hired by the hospital, but rather are, in some sense, attracted, right? Which is kind of unusual. And the main thing is that the doctors are not on payroll, right? Not paid hospital, which is interesting. So that kind of brings up an interesting point, right? Because typically in a labor market, the way that businesses compete for labor is through wages, right? If you want to attract better employees, you have to offer higher wages than your competitors, right? But in this case, that's not a way that hospitals can compete for doctors. They can't compete by paying them higher wages because they're not on payroll. They aren't paid a wage by the hospital, right? So there must be some other ways that the hospital can try to compete for doctors, right? Now, like I mentioned earlier, one strategy for the hospital is to buy private practices, right? And have the doctors that already exist in that private practice become part of the medical staff. But this doesn't really alleviate the issue, right? Because those physicians that are part of the practice that the practice purchased by the hospital, they can choose to go somewhere else. They don't have to practice. So in a sense, this really doesn't change much, even though it seems like it might be a way for hospitals to get doctors. So there's got to be something else, right? There's got to be something else attracting these doctors. Now, it's interesting to know that some really is kind of unique to the United States. There are different setups, different systems. So, just for example, in Great Britain and in Germany, they have what are called community doctors, but those doctors have the ability to admit patients to a hospital. And so they have to, if a patient, if a community doctor believes that a patient needs to go to the hospital, they have to be referred to yet another that can admit them to a hospital. So it's not like this everywhere. So I guess just keep that in mind, right? And like I've been saying, competition for doctors is really unlike labor in any other type of industry, right? Um, and in a sense, it's because that doctors are kind of like employees, but they're not really because they're not on payroll. But in a way, they're kind of like customers, right? And hopefully this will kind of become clear in a second in the way that hospitals compete for physicians. It's almost as if they're in some way a customer of the hospital. So that's kind of an interesting thing, interesting way to think about the relationship here. Duplicated that slide. And we can really tie this into the profit sharing issue discussed in the last chapter, right? So maybe one way to attract physicians is make them the residual claimant, right? Do things for them that essentially benefit them and their profitability in their own practice. So if you remember, that's the Pauly Reedish model. And actually they focus on that problem quite intensively, right? So they really focus in on this issue. And what they end up doing is they end up characterizing the hospital as if the doctors own it, right? As if they are the sole residual claimant. And that would be one way to attract doctors, right? Is to make it as if they are the owners of the hospital, even though they're not, right? But we should keep in mind that it's unlikely that doctors can fully capture the hospital, right? Even though they do have a lot of power within the hospital's organization, it's not likely that they can fully capture the residuals. So, but this is a pretty good model, and this helps describe a way in which hospitals can compete for doctors. So this particularly applies when we think about specialty, right? Um, some types of doctors might be more attracted to a hospital given its goals, right? So, we've got Emory Hospital here in Atlanta, and they part of their goal is they really focus on like advanced treatments for cancer and other things like that, leukemia, and so that might attract certain specialists, right? Because that's part of their goal is to have some of the most advanced treatment technologies in the country. And obviously, some physicians are going to be attracted to that. They want to be a part of it, right? So really, this sort of thinking of the doctors as owners or residual claimants, it's not that they're getting, you know, profit, right? It's not that they're getting pure profit. It's that the excess revenue is being spent in a way that it attracts types of doctors in a way that's almost like the doctors are capturing the profit. But it's not that they're capturing profit, it's that the hospital is buying advanced MRI machines, and that attracts certain doctors because they want to work with that technology or something like that, right? It allows them to do things they couldn't do otherwise without the hospital. So this could be things like ICUs, right? Intensive care units, whether it's a NICU or a SICU, which is cardiac intensive care unit. Equipment could be labs, other facilities that are too expensive for an individual practice or physician. So this is something the hospital can provide as an incentive for doctors to come and be part of the medical staff. There's some other things potentially. You know, what is the level of the provision of assistance, right? So how many, what's the nursing staff like? Do you have a really good nursing staff that provides really good assistance? Do you have a good pharmacist? Do you have does the hospital have a large availability of emergency standby equipment? Are the labs do they conduct prompt lab work? So there's lots of potential things that could attract a physician to become part of the medical staff. Um, and keep in mind too that well, maybe we'll talk about this on the next slide. So let me just move ahead. Yeah, we'll talk about it here. So in a lot of ways, in terms of sort of market power, right? Doctors and hospitals are actually more or less on equal footing, right? Hospitals need doctors, but in a lot of ways, doctors also need hospitals, and it kind of relates back to what we've been talking about so far. So one way to think about it is that if you're looking at an area that has one or maybe two hospitals, they are going to have more market power, right? Because there's not, in a sense, they're a monopsony, right? Do you guys remember what a monopsony is? It's when there's one buyer, right? Um, so in this sense, we're kind of thinking of the hospitals as buying the doctors, right? So it's kind of like a monopsony. And in that case, the doctor doesn't have much of a choice. It's like, well, there's only two hospitals, or maybe even only one, in which case the hospital really has more substantial market power. Um, and then similarly, right there, where we have hospitals in regions that are maybe intrinsically attractive to doctors, like maybe LA, right? Who doesn't like to live in Los Angeles, Southern California? That would be maybe intrinsically attractive to doctors. Um, those types of hospitals don't need to fight as hard to get physicians because they're intrinsically attractive already because of their location. Um, and there might be other examples, but basically, um, in a lot of ways, at the end of the day, they need each other, right? Hospitals need doctors and doctors need hospitals. And because of the differences in market power according to region or area, there's going to be different types of bargains struck between doctors and hospitals, right? Depending on the sort of area it's in and the resulting market powers. Yeah. So this is going to depend on the strength of either party, right, within the marketplace, given their uniqueness as a medical resource. Um, So in a town with one hospital, even though it's only one hospital, so it might have a lot of market power, there might be only one neurosurgeon, right? And it's that neurosurgeon, because of their unique ability, is still going to have a lot of market power, even though there's only one hospital in town, right? Because they can always say, "Well, I'll go somewhere else if you can't give me what I want," right? I'll move to Seattle or something and get out of this podunk town. Um, so it all depends on a lot of different issues. So just to give you some examples of the types of things that take place, some hospitals actually require that every doctor on their medical staff provide some time in the emergency room. Okay, so in this case, the hospital has more power, right? If you want to be on our medical staff, you've got to work in the emergency room, at least 15 hours a week. So that's something that some hospitals can leverage, right? Um, But then there's other hospitals where there's no such requirement, and in fact, the hospital actually gives the doctor some office space, perhaps for free even, that the doctor can see patients within the hospital, right? Um, so you can kind of see in these two examples the different types of power that might exist, right? So in the first case, the hospital has a lot of power. It can force its members to serve emergency room time. Whereas in the other example, the hospital is less powerful. It has to give doctors office space to attract them, right? And it doesn't require these sorts of emergency room time requirements, right? So really, what's at issue here is the hospital's ability to increase the doctor's profitability, right? That's how the doctor is a residual claimant. It's not like it's getting a check, right, from the hospital saying, here's your fraction of the profit, right? But rather it's the hospital spending extra money on nice labs, a good nursing staff, advanced medical equipment. And these things allow the doctor to be more profitable in their own private practice, right? Because part of being on the medical staff is that you get to use the resources that the hospital has to offer, right? So that the hospital isn't paying you, but it's providing you with resources. It's providing the doctor with resources that can make the doctor's practice more profitable, right? And that's the mechanism or the way in which the residual is sort of given back to the doctors, right? So this is really the main way that hospitals are competing for doctors, right? And again, it depends on the market power of each side, right? But at the end of the day, hospitals have to somehow attract doctors to come be part of their medical staff. They can't do it with wages, so they have to do it with something else, and it's typically these types of things, right? Now, something that is going to have something that's going to play a role in all this is how hospital care is paid for, right? So, depending on how it's paid for, um, we can see how competition for doctors can become really costly, right? So, that's exactly what we're talking about. Um, the way to compete for doctors is to provide them with really great stuff. Well, of course, really great stuff costs more money, right? Just like everything in life, right? So this type of competition can get pretty costly, especially in environments where health insurance pays for most of the costs of hospitalization. Because in that case, it doesn't affect the patient, right? The patient doesn't care. Insurance covers it. Doctors don't care. It doesn't affect the patient negatively. So yeah, let's spend more money, right? So anytime there's insurance involved, these costs can really start to blow up, right? And kind of like we've been describing, this competition really manifests itself in a technology intensive war, right? We've got the best technology, we've got the best nurses on staff, we've got the best facilities. They're clean, they smell great, right? All these things cost a lot of money, and that's how. So it's kind of interesting because even though it's not a competition through wages for doctors, it still obviously ends up costing the hospital money. And so we'll talk about this later in the chapter, probably not today, but on Monday. This is exactly what appears to have happened in the United States, at least until recently. So there's some good evidence that suggests that this idea is holds water, right? It's a valid idea. All right, so now let's talk about patients, right? The hospital and patients. So they also have to attract patients. And like I said earlier, sometimes the things that are useful in attracting doctors are also useful in attracting patients, right? So top of the line facilities, um, advanced medical equipment, right? And this is especially true again if the patient has health insurance, right? Um, if the patient doesn't have to worry about prices, then really at the end of the day, all they're going to care about is quality of care. And quality of care is higher when there's better technology and better nursing staff and those sorts of things, right? So sometimes they go together, but sometimes different things matter. So sometimes there are things that matter to physicians that don't matter to patients, and vice versa. And sometimes in the course of competing for doctors, uh, those actions conflict with the hospital's efforts to compete for patients, right? So they go against each other. So these are all possibilities. We'll talk about each of them. So for patients, one of the most important things is reputation, right? Reputation, particularly in providing high quality of care. That's a primary incentive for patients. But of course, other things might matter. Quality of food, especially if you're an inpatient, right? And you have to stay at the hospital for a while. You're going to care about the quality of the food. You might care about the friendliness of the nursing staff. You almost certainly care about how close it is to your home, right? The proximity to your home, cleanliness, and even price, perhaps, right? Which is unusual. Typically, that's one of the most important things that people care about is price, right? But the reason that price might not matter as much is because of health insurance, right? Price only matters a little because of health insurance. So, of course, price is going to matter more to people that are uninsured than people that are insured because they have to pay out of pocket, right? They don't have health insurance. So, price is going to matter more to those types of people than those that are insured. So we could think about an extreme case where price is effectively zero, right? Full coverage insurance. In that case, the hospital can't use price as a way to compete for patients because price is zero effectively to the patient, right? So there's got to be other ways to attract the patient, and then sometimes that works in tandem with attracting doctors, but not always. So let's think about some of those. Um, So, like I said, for patients that have partial insurance or are completely uninsured, price is going to matter a lot more. Um, Now, in this case, where patients are uninsured, um, the things that the hospital does to attract doctors is going to increase the cost of care and therefore increase the price, right? So in this case, um, providing better equipment and better labs and better nursing staff is going to increase the cost and therefore the price. So it kind of depends really on the insurance status of the patient, right? The things that attract doctors are also going to attract patients, but only those that have insurance. It's actually going to repel patients that don't have insurance, right? Because the hospital's buying more expensive equipment, hiring better nurses, those sorts of things. Of course, the price has to go up in order to support that, and so that's going to turn off patients that don't have insurance, right? They care about price a lot, but it's not going to turn off or repel insured patients, right? They don't have to pay the price. They don't care about price as much, if at all. So that's really where the main difference lies is the insurance status of the patient, right? Insured patients are going to be attracted by the same things that attract doctors. Uninsured patients are going to be repelled by the things that attract doctors, right? So, um, and I guess thinking about the Affordable Care Act and trying to get everybody on insurance, that would have a major impact on this, right? Because if the Affordable Care Act is successful and gets almost everybody insured, well, then we're talking about the things that attract doctors also attracting patients, and we don't have to worry about uninsured people, right? Because there aren't any. So there's a major role for the Affordable Care Act to play here. But in any case, right, when we have uninsured or only partially insured patients, the things that are attracting doctors are repelling those types of patients. So there's a conflict there. Another way to think about it is that these patients are paying for quality on the margin, right? So they're really thinking about marginal choices, right? Do I get a little bit extra care? I have to pay for it, right? So I'm going to think about that small change. Whereas the insured patient isn't really going to think about the margin as much, right? Um, they don't have to incur the cost, so they don't think in the margin as much as uninsured patients. So in the good old days, which I'm not really sure what time period that was, but back in the day, I guess most insurance plans covered most or nearly all expenses, and in response, hospitals took a quality approach in attracting both doctors and patients, which makes sense from our previous discussion, right? If insurance is covering most of the cost, patients don't care about price, and they only care primarily about quality, right? And so that's the approach that hospitals have taken primarily to attract patients, and as it turns out, those things also tend to attract doctors as well. So Pauli in 1978 looked at the cost of various hospitals and compared it with the makeup of their medical staff as sort of a way to try to investigate this issue a little bit. And what he found was that there was a strong connection between the composition of the medical staff and the hospital's costs. Um, Now, unfortunately, he wasn't able to determine causality, right? So he wasn't sure if the high costs caused the composition of the medical staff or if the composition of the medical staff caused high costs. So it's not exactly clear which direction the causality is going, but this at least points us in the direction of saying, okay, maybe it's true that the way that hospitals attract good doctors is by providing a lot of expensive stuff for them, right? Um, so some very superficial evidence, I suppose. Um, Now, in today's world, insurance is a little bit different. There's a lot of insurance that only covers partial costs or pays, lump sums per day, for example. So in those cases, price still matters, right? Price still matters quite a bit. Um, Whoops. You can ignore that second bullet point. That's from the first slide, or the previous slide, rather. Um, so thinking about this issue, that price will still matter in a more contemporary insurance environment. One study attempted to estimate the demand curve confronting individual hospitals in order to kind of get at this answer. How much does price actually matter, right? We can imagine that it matters at least a little bit. So the question then is well, how much does it matter? So this is something undertaken by Feldman and Dowd, and they were using data from the St. Paul, Minneapolis metropolitan area in 1984. And they basically estimated the demand curves facing 31 hospitals in that area. Now, of course, if price doesn't matter, what should they find? And think about it in terms of elasticity, because that's usually the measure of interest is elasticity. So if price doesn't matter, what will be true about the elasticity?
Will it be inelastic?
Right, exactly. Yeah, the less price matters, the steeper that demand curve gets, right? And that means less elastic or more inelastic, right? And then the more price matters, the flatter it gets. So that's really what we're looking at here is what are the elasticities of demand, right? So one way we can interpret the elasticity of demand is it's providing us with sort of an approximation or a proxy for the degree of competitiveness, right? So if it's very competitive, right, we should see a demand curve that looks like a perfectly competitive market's demand curve, flat. If it's less competitive, it's going to be steeper. Um, so under a common model of market pricing that's commonly used in economics, there's an approximation for elasticity, and the approximation is basically it's the market demand elasticity divided by the share of the market held by the firm. So this is a nice approximation so that we don't have to do more complicated math. If we know the market demands elasticity and we know the market share that the hospital has, then we can come up with an approximation for the firm's demand elasticity. So for example, if the market demand elasticity is -1, unit elastic, and the firm has a 10% market share, then its demand curve should have a elasticity of -10. Okay, so -1 divided by 0.1 is -10, right? And this is actually coming from an oligopoly model. So this is arising under a model of oligopoly pricing, where the assumption is that a particular firm, firm I, sets its price, assuming that no other firm in the market changes its output if it changes its output. So that's just kind of that's the common model we're referring to here. It's not that important that you understand that, but just so you know, the common model is this oligopoly model. All right, so let's go back to this study then, right? So given this approximation that we have, going back to the data from this study, we can kind of make our own approximation. So the area that they looked at had 34 hospitals. 3 of them didn't have cost data, which is why they only were able to estimate 31 demand curves. But given that there's 34 hospitals, and given that the market demand in that city should be about the same as what was found in the RAND health insurance study, which in that case, they found that the elasticity was -0.15. If we assume that each hospital if they equally share the market, right, so that each hospital has 1/34 of the market, then we can use that approximation from the previous slide to estimate or guess the individual hospital's elasticity, right? So in this case, it would be negative 0.15, the market elasticity, the market demand elasticity divided by 1/34, which ends up being negative 5.1. And what they found was actually pretty close to that, target or that approximation. So they found that for private pay patients, so patients that didn't have insurance, in other words, their elasticity was about -4, not too far off. And for patients that had Blue Cross insurance, it was -2.3, which makes sense too, right? Insurance makes demand less elastic, right? So lower number there. So it seems like the approximation works pretty well. And the difference probably comes from, well, I'm not sure where the difference comes from. Could be that the market demand is slightly different in that region. I'm not sure what else it could come from, but that might be the main cause. I'm not sure. But in any case, the approximation did pretty good, right? It wasn't too far off, especially with the private pay patients. They also used a slightly different approach. They directly estimated the demand facing each hospital. And when they did that, they found price elasticities closer to unit elastic, -1, which of course suggests that the hospitals actually have more market power than the previous estimate suggests. So they're more like a monopoly than we might have supposed, given the approximation we used. So, unfortunately, this is about all the research that exists on this issue. And this, keep in mind, this was in the late 80s. So, there's still some open questions here. There's still some things that need to be investigated. So, but one important thing that has changed in more recent decades is the prevalence of managed care insurance plans, right? They're becoming more and more popular and growing in importance and market share. And we look at managed care in Chapter 11. So I think, yeah, like 2 weeks from now, we'll look at that. And we can expect that the elasticity of demand facing hospitals will increase as a result of this. And the reason for that is that, and keep in mind, right, an increase in elasticity means things are getting more competitive, right? That demand curve is getting flatter. And the reason for this is because one of the main purposes of managed care is that they shop for lower prices. Okay, so they're actively searching, the insurance company itself is actively searching for lower prices, which improves or increases the competitiveness for hospitals, right? And so managed care is actually driving hospitals to be more competitive, which is good, right? We know that competition leads to better efficiency and higher societal surplus, right? So, which I think is why managed care is growing in popularity. It seems to be doing a good job at improving efficiency and reducing prices and costs. So, and that's what we've seen. Now, all these estimates, right, these elasticities suggest that something is going on other than a purely competitive model, right? These hospitals are not existing in a competitive market. They're at best monopolistically competitive, right? At worst, they're a monopoly. But in any case, it's certainly not perfect competition, right? So in the next section, which I think, yeah, we'll get to that. I think we have time. Yeah, we still got 20 minutes. In the next section, we're going to look at a model that is sort of the beginnings of a way to describe how hospitals determine price and quality jointly. So that's another, again, right? So we're dealing with something that's very unusual compared to other industries, right? Typically, the only problem the firm faces is choosing the combination of quantity and price, right? But here, hospitals have to consider quality as well. And that, I guess that's not to say that other industries don't care about quality. They do, but it's not as complex as the issue that hospitals face. And this is actually a really important problem in the U.S., particularly, and there's a lot of potential implications for public policy as a result of this. So we'll start to see some of that as we look at the model. But let's learn the basic model first, right? So this model comes from Newhouse and his discussion in his 1970 paper, looking at how hospitals make decisions. And he uses the utility maximization model, right? He looks at a hospital as having a utility function, and the utility function is basically just describing the various goals of the hospital and how it balances those goals. And in the simplest model, the hospital only cares about quantity and quality, right? So size translating into quantity and quality. So the utility function we saw and talked about in the last chapter, right? But this is just the most simple version of the model. We can generalize it to include other things like physician salary, nurse salary, really anything that the hospital might care about. But this is the simplest model. So we're going to start with this model and then talk about how the market forces, most notably competition and insurance, change the outcomes. I don't think we'll get to that today. We'll have to pick that up on next week. But that's where we're headed here. Okay, let's see. Right, so again, the basic setup is that the hospital has a utility function, and it's trying to maximize that utility. And the only two things it cares about is the number of patients it serves and the quality of service. Now, of course, they face a constraint, right, in this maximization problem. They face the constraint of the consumer's willingness to pay or the patient's willingness to pay. And the way that we represent that in the model is as a inverse demand curve. So basically price as a function of quantity and quality. And it's the usual downward sloping demand curve or inverse demand curve, right? Willingness to pay decreases with total quantity, but it increases with the quality of care. So that's kind of interesting and different, right? So we have the usual downward sloping demand curve, and then really this second issue regarding quality is that there's different demand curves for different levels of quality, right? That's really the way we're going to look at it. And then there's one other constraint, right? The nonprofit or not-for-profit hospital has to break even so that its revenues equals its costs, right? So we basically have the inverse demand curve here. Whoops, not quite yet. Here we go, just trying to get my laser pointer. Right, we have the inverse demand curve here. Price as a function of quantity and quality. You multiply the price times quantity, and that gives you revenue, right? And then that revenue has to equal the costs of providing that quantity and quality because it's not for profit, right? All right, so graphically, what does this look like? Well, over here in figure A, we have the demand curves, right? So downward sloping like normal demand curves. And we're going to have separate demand curves for different levels of quality. Okay, so S1 is the lowest level of quality, S3 is the highest level of quality. So there's going to be a higher willingness to pay for higher quality, right? That should be intuitive. And then, of course, there's a negative relationship between quantity and price, right? So the downward slope. So we have different demand curves depending on quality. Over here, we have the cost curves for the hospital. And those also depend on quality, right? So the higher the quality, the higher the cost curves, right? The higher the cost is. Okay. And then this is just showing that if the hospital chooses a quantity N1, then we can figure out the various prices it would have to charge, right? So obviously for higher levels of quality, the firm or the hospital charges higher prices. So that's how we're thinking about this. And if we put these two pictures together, we kind of get to a sort of an equilibrium, right? So combine these two sides of the market, we get this really ugly picture right here. So we have some demand curves. The numbers correspond to quality. Okay, so 1 is the lowest quality, 4 is the highest quality. And same thing with the cost curves, right? So 1 is the lowest quality, 4 is the highest quality. Higher quality costs more. And then basically what we get is some different possibilities, right? So each demand curve for a specific quality, such as S1, has to intersect a corresponding cost curve at either 2 points, 1 point, or no points. Those are the only possibilities. So you can see, for example, if you look at quality level 3, so demand 3 and cost 3, you can see that those two intersect at 2 different points. So that's one possibility. Not drawn is the last possibility. So we actually don't see any of these that never cross, but that is possible, right? It could be that the demand curve for quality 1, it could be that it's down here, doesn't cross at all, which basically means that the hospital doesn't provide that level of quality. It can't because nobody demands it. And then the only other possibility is that it's exactly tangent, which we see one example of that right here with the level of quality 4. But in any case, we have these intersections. And basically these points at which they intersect are the combinations of price, cost, and quality and quantity that keep the hospital in equilibrium, right? Because again, it has to break even, right? So at an intersection, the price, right? For example, this intersection here, the price that the hospital charges allows them to break even. And that's true at every single intersection, right? So we can think of those as equilibrium points, which is why this curve is labeled E, right? Those are all the possible equilibrium points. Now you might be curious why it's drawn through, like in this case where there's 2 intersections, you might be curious why it crosses the one that's lower. And the reason for that is because, yes, the hospital could operate here, right? It could operate here and break even. But we have to remember that one of the hospital's goals is to have higher quantity. So compared to this, the other intersection has a higher quantity, right? Does that make sense? So we can actually ignore these intersections that are lower quantity. The only ones that matter are the ones that end up with a higher quantity. So that's why it crosses through these ones. We can ignore these other intersections. Okay. I think I described that in these bullet points, right? But again, these are equilibrium points because these are places where the price is equal to average cost. And so it breaks even. Now, if no intersections occur, then it's not, that level or that choice of quality is not feasible. The hospital would not be able to sustain that level of quality given the demand for that quality. And so that won't end up being a quality that's provided in the long run. You know, I guess a hospital might try it out, but they would quickly learn that it's not sustainable, right? Okay, so I already mentioned this. When 2 intersections occur, the one to the lower right is the best one for the hospital, right? And that's because hospitals prefer to produce more hospital care. That's part of their utility function. They want N to be higher, right? And in any case, we're assuming that quality is fixed, right? So if we're looking at D3 and AC3, we're assuming that quality is fixed at 3, right? So the only other thing that matters is the number of patients, right? So that's why when there's 2 intersections, it's the one that provides a higher quantity that matters, right? We can ignore the one that provides lower quantity. All right, and then combining all these points, we have basically an equilibrium line, essentially. And it's continuous as long as quality can be varied continuously as well. And as we can see here, just like the one that's illustrated, this can either slope downward or upward, but ultimately only the downward portion should matter. And that's because on the upward portion, the hospital can get better quantity and quality, which it cares about both of those things, right? So the hospital would never choose to be somewhere on this part of the EE curve. It would want to improve quantity and quality until the point where those then become a trade-off, right? So where this is downward sloping, those are now trade-offs, right? If you want higher quality, the price goes up, but then quantity is going to go down. So the downward portion is where there's a trade-off between quality and quantity. Where it's upward sloping, there is no trade-off. So the hospital would move in the what is that, northeasterly direction, right, until it reaches the downward sloping part. So the upward sloping part we can essentially ignore. It doesn't matter to the hospital. It's gonna move to a part where it's downward sloping. Okay, so we can kind of see like the different possibilities, right? This is showing us the different possibilities, the different possible combinations of quality and quantity, right? But then the next question is, well, which of these combinations does the hospital actually choose? And to answer that question, we move to indifference curves, right? So remember, the hospital has a utility function that it's trying to maximize. So get in this direction as possible, get as high on that utility hill as possible. But the constraint now is the combinations of quality and quantity given by this EE curve, right? Now, of course, here we have quantity on one axis, but we don't have quality, right? So we want to transform this EE curve so that it sits in a quantity quality space, which is what we do here. And what ends up happening is that when we transform it, it ends up looking pretty much just like a PPF, right? So these are all the possible equilibrium points for the hospital that are different combinations of quality and quantity. And it's going to pick the combination of those two things that give it the highest utility. So pretty standard indifference curve analysis. The only difference is that instead of a budget constraint, we have a production possibilities frontier. So that's what the hospital is going to do. It's going to pick the best of those possible equilibrium points, right? And again, we can make this transformation because each point on that EE curve describes a unique combination of quality and quantity. So that's where the PPF is coming from, right? So that's the basic model. So from here, we're basically going to start to consider how changes in the competitive environment, as well as changes in, or rather the introduction of insurance, how those two things can alter the outcomes in the market, right? And basically the competitiveness is going to have an impact on this production possibilities frontier curve. If there's more competition, this thing is basically going to shift inward. And then as far as insurance goes, that's going to have an impact as well on the production possibilities, because it's basically going to determine it's going to determine the elasticity of demand, right? And so that's going to determine basically, let me go back a couple, this will help eliminate this. Right. Insurance question is going to change the slope of these demand curves, right? It's going to rotate them clockwise. And that's going to change the equilibrium line, is where we got the PPF from, right? So both competition and insurance are basically affecting the demand curves, right? If there's more curves shift inward, and if there's insurance, they rotate and become steeper. And both of those things have an impact on on the production possibilities of the hospital. Okay, so that's where we're headed next time. So on Monday, looking ahead, we'll look at this issue of insurance and competition, how they play roles. And then we'll look at the interaction of doctors and hospitals, right? This thinking more about the ways that hospitals attract doctors, giving them goodies. And then we'll look at the interaction of doctors and hospitals in terms of attracting patients. We'll look at some differences or rather some changes in the competitive landscape over time. We'll look at how for-profit hospitals play an important role in entry and exit decisions. And then we'll wrap it up by looking at the hospital and the role it plays in labor markets, particularly for nurses. And we'll look at the issue of a supposed nursing shortage, right? So, and we should be able to cover all that on Monday. And if we have time left over, we'll start chapter 10, but at the very least, we should be able to get through this on Monday. And then on Wednesday, we'll start chapter 10 if we don't get to start it on Monday. And chapter 10 is demand for insurance, right? So again, right, remember that that health insurance, or the market for health, right, involves three parties. It's the suppliers, the demanders, and then insurance. So we're almost done with the supply side of medical care, looking at physicians and hospitals. So of course, the next thing to look at is insurance and the different types of insurance. So first we'll look at the demand for insurance, then we'll look at the supply for insurance, and then we'll look at government provided insurance with Medicare and Medicaid. And once we get through that, we're pretty close to the end of the semester. So I updated our schedule. It didn't change too much, but of course the material on the exam changed. So now we're only going through chapter 8 for this weekend's exam. And then I kind of had to try to squeeze in some stuff. So we're going to try to cover chapter 10 in one day, but we may not be able to. But chapters 10, 11, and 12, we have basically 5 days to cover those chapters before the third exam. So anyway, just to kind of give you a heads up of where we're going. But the main thing for you this week is your second exam. So make sure you're starting to prepare for that. It's due Saturday. It'll be available Friday morning, basically at midnight Friday morning. So you'll have 2 whole days to complete it. So that's where we're going. Okay. Any questions? Yes, Blythe.
For the home. Oh, never mind. Already answered. We're good.
Cool. All right. Anything else? All right. Well, y'all have a good weekend. Good luck on your exams. And I will see you next Monday.